Welcome to this special webinar with Kinetic IT, Dragos and MySecurity Marketplace. My name's Chris Cubbage. I'm the editor with MySecurity Media. Resilient infrastructure, secure future, cyber strategies for critical infrastructure. Naturally, we'll be diving into cybersecurity protection and what is actually happening in and around Australia and the cybersecurity landscape as well. Now, thank you to our panel coming on screen now. And we would like to acknowledge a country. I'm based in Sydney, and we've got some teams in Perth as well, but we acknowledge the traditional landowners, the Noongars in Western Australia and the Gadigal peoples in Sydney as well. But from wherever you're listening from, we pay our respects to our traditional owners, past, present and leaders emerging. But thank you very much, and hopefully we have some of our people with us in this session. Some housekeeping, a recorded session has been recording. We'll go for about 60 minutes. We will stop at the top of the hour. Please participate within Q&A and also in some of the polls. We don't have too many polls, but just a few to get some insights. I'd like to welcome our panel, Tony Campbell, Gayatri Prasad and Heath Moodie. Panelists, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Chris.
Nice to be here, Chris.
Thank you, Chris.
Maybe just a very brief introduction. We'll start with Tony. Maybe just what your current role is, and then we'll move through to Gayatri and Heath.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. My name's Tony Campbell. I'm the principal for cybersecurity in Kinetic. What that role means is I look after all of security consulting for Kinetic IT. So we're a national company. We've got delivery capability across most of the major capital cities, and my job is to make sure that we're doing a job in pen testing, delivering things like GRC consulting, and very pertinent to this one, which is doing work alongside our security operations center in critical infrastructure, where we're very much monitoring and looking at the incident response capabilities across the critical infrastructure sector.
Beautiful. And Gayatri?
Morning, Chris. Morning, everyone. Gayatri, I'm the corporate ISM for Kinetic IT right now, and I bring the GRC experience from multiple domains across different continents. Worked with a lot of customers in the IT in the past as well. So my passion and experience around GRC is about stitching everything together. Got too much going on in terms of legislations and regulations. How do we make it simpler?
Understandable. There's a cybersecurity bill alive right now. And Heath, I think you're here in Sydney with me.
No, Brisbane. How dare you?
Sorry.
So hi everyone. My name's Heath Moodie. I'm from the Dragos team. I'm one of the senior threat researchers for the region for Australia. And my sort of remit sort of comes into how do we help critical infrastructure engage with and directly counter the likely adversaries they're going to face in region and how they actually do it.
That's nice. And we're going to come back to you, Heath, very shortly, just to give us an overview of the threat landscape. Just more back to the audience and to who's actually joining us in the room. We had quite a number of registrations, so for those that aren't signing in live, we'll have a look at the recorded session. But it's a good breakdown and it's quite strong in government there, around 30% of regulatory bodies, healthcare, energy and utilities, around 20%, otherwise specialised services. But it's a really good mix, ports and transport, emergency services and regulatory agencies over there as well. So local government also. So it's a really good mix. And in saying all of that in terms of who we've got in the room, it's timely. ASD just released the annual cyber threat report. Critical infrastructure there for 2023 to 2024 represents around 11% of the cybersecurity incidents. But given that the key word is being critical, these are our 11 sectors for critical infrastructure. Most common activity types out of today's report: phishing, exploitation of public-facing applications, and brute force activity. 3 most common cybersecurity incident types: compromised accounts, malware infection, and compromised asset network or infrastructure, with denial of service and distributed denial of service overrepresented, I beg your pardon, in critical infrastructure cybersecurity incidents. And the most frequently reported CI sectors were electricity, gas, water and waste services, education and training, and transport, postal and warehousing. So interesting, ASD released that that report this morning. We'll have the link within the show notes as well, and I'll put it up in the chat shortly. But please check that out. It's a great segue to what we're currently seeing with our panelists. Heath, maybe Dragos, this is your area for sure. Maybe give us an insights into the current landscape for you and what your observations are.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so everyone, so it is a pretty loaded question on the threat landscape piece, and I think normally when people expect someone from Dragos to come speak, they want to talk all about the largest and the greatest threat actors and sort of what they're doing, particularly from the nation state level. However, today I sort of really want to take a sort of a secondary approach and talk about the rise of hacktivism and ransomware groups as it relates to critical infrastructure. The reason why I want to talk to those two in particular today is because from the hacktivism side, this year particularly, we've seen a serious increase in the capability of a general hacktivists. Okay, so your middle tier hacktivists and sort of what they're able to do as it stands. Now, I understand when most people hear the word hacktivist, they just immediately sort of switch off and think DDoS sort of website defacement sort of thing. And what does that sort of have to do with critical infrastructure? I will sort of directly point you to a number of examples we've seen where hacktivists have able to achieve stage 2 of the ICS kill chain. So that's actually going into level 0 and level 1 on the Purdue model against ICS equipment across the US, the EU, and in some parts reported for Australia. So this threat is real from them, and this isn't just one group, okay? We're, from a Dragos side, we're actively tracking a number of hacktivists within this space. All of them largely related to, particularly more from the successful side, largely coming off of the geopolitical landscape from the Russia-Ukrainian war and the Israel Hamas and Iran war. The reason why that has great significance here is because those ICS attacks that I mentioned, the hacktivist groups directly claimed and attributed their attacks to supporting those war efforts. So for a very, very small town in Ireland, North Mayo, their water treatment facility plant was taken down by the pro-Iranian group, as they had claimed that any Israeli-made equipment was a valid target for them in their conflict. And that then that very small town was without clean water and operational facilities for a number of days, okay? And so the hacktivist threat is real, and we do need to start taking care of it more. It isn't just a defacement and a DDoS now. It is a very real piece, and it's a growing capability, largely off of open source tooling that you can get off of sort of just a standard GitHub or just off of a standard Kali Linux. The capability jump you're able to do from that space now is quite large, and we as defenders need to be able to deal with it adequately. Secondly, on that ransomware piece, we are seeing a number of an exponential case of ransomware, and particularly ransomware variants and groups, going to specifically target ICS equipment now, as they now have the capability to get down into the ICS space and actually ransom those pieces of equipment using the communication methods that are used down there, like your Modbus, for example, right? The sort of core 3 and 4 groups that I really want organizations to sort of really pay attention to, particularly when it relates to ICS ransomware, is Lockbit, the Play ransomware, and another one called Black Basta. The Lockbit has had 66 incidents already this year. The Play has had 31, and then Black Basta has had 27. Those are specific ICS-related organizations just this year. Okay, those are the sort of 2 key points I really want to start off with today. I will now open it up to the group if they want to talk about anything else as well.
Great, thank you, Heath. And those ransomware groups are quite, as you say, or hacktivist groups. It's good because it gives you what their TTPs are. We do have a question. Use just from the audience. Use the Q&A better because there might be some questions we can answer offline as well. But there's a reference here to AI, the hacktivist activity increasing or correlating due to increased capabilities and availability of AI. We'll come back to that, but obviously that they use a range of different tool sets and there's no shortage of those tool sets out in the wild that they can use. Tony, I suppose just from the threat landscape and you know, having a real job of protecting critical infrastructure and you're having those responsibilities, there's no one fix and there's a lot happening globally that can impact locally. It's a bit of a strategic approach that's required. And how do you find most enterprises to have to grapple that? They need to break it down within that strategy. Muted.
That's the first one.
Rookie error. Yeah, thanks, Chris. Thanks everyone else for joining as well. Look, I guess following the trend of modernization and digital transformation that we're seeing everywhere across all forms of business, critical infrastructure and operational technology is no different. The fact is, a lot of those devices that we've got within OT networks are being replaced by IoT devices. So a lot of them are coming internet enabled. They're becoming remotely managed. They have to be patched in the way that, you know, all devices these days are being patched, the same way that our fridges have to be patched. And as a result of that, we're seeing a lot of the traditional cyber attacks that we used to deal with on the IT side of the house now applying in the OT side as well. So in terms of that threat landscape targeting OT systems, the threat actors are becoming more sophisticated and aggressive, while it's becoming more accessible to get those attacks actually targeting those which were once remote and offline and air-gapped systems, which makes their job easier, right, as attackers. As Heath alluded to, state-sponsored actors, ransomware gangs, supply chain vulnerabilities, these are all on the rise. And they're all things that we need to be considering today. And attacks, as we know, against OT systems, this isn't a new thing. This is something we've been dealing with for years. You know, if you go back as far as Stuxnet, whenever the nuclear centrifuges were compromised by supposedly the CIA and Mossad, that was kind of what kicked us off into this whole evolution of cyber warfare. And that's where we are today. We're in a position where our OT systems, our most critical systems, are being targeted by these kind of state-sponsored actors. But now, as Heath alluded to, you're getting other forms of threat actor also targeting those organizations because of the effect that they can have. Terrorism against OT systems, hacktivism against OT systems, they all have a great impact and a great effect and can actually get people's voices heard whenever they're using that as a means to get their message across. What we are seeing, though, is obviously a lot of change coming through from government. So if you look at, what we're doing with AUKUS and getting nuclear submarines, we're talking about nuclear power plants coming in the future. All of these things are going to change the dynamic of the way we protect the future of OT, critical infrastructure, and energy production. So having a different threat landscape and having a different set of things that we're trying to actually protect means we have to think differently about what the future of OT security looks like. We talk a lot about things like segmentation of OT networks, limiting attack surfaces, securing the supply chain, security operations, all of those sort of things. But I think one of the key things that we need to consider is how we build a cogent security story within the program that aligns to compliance, but also does actual security change and control down at the deepest level of the organization, because that's really where the attacks happen. They happen at exposed sensors that are sitting inside the network. You make a tweak to a sensor, and that can change the whole dynamic of how an entire control system works. That's the kind of thing that we're needing to protect. So while legislation and things like that move forward and they're put in place for a very good reason, we also have to be very aware of what we're doing right at the lowest levels. The only way we're going to do that is to have OT knowledge within the cyber team and have cyber knowledge within the OT team. So bridging the gap between the two sides of what used to be two sides of the network and two sides of the organization. They need to come together and work together. That partnership is the only way we're going to succeed moving forward.
I'll quickly just answer Mike's question that he did post in already.
Go for it.
So, Mike, that's a really good question, mate. I want to directly answer this as I did write a report quite recently on this. So, yes, we are seeing that. However, I'm going to be really specific with my language here. From a Dragos side, we have not observed an adversary use an AI or an LLM through the full cycle of a successful attack. What we have observed them doing is using LLMs for reconnaissance and successful capability development and also research. Okay, so very specific pieces there. And I'm talking specifically when I say this about the cyber avengers. So OpenAI also did a really good report on this that is public, that I'm posting in the chat for you now. And what they're essentially saying is a lot of what sort of we're saying as well, where the adversaries are using this very similar to how we're all using LLMs and AI right now, where it's very exploratory. It's very, what can this do for us? Can we do bits and pieces here or there that will help me sort of understand something? Okay. What we aren't seeing and what we haven't observed yet is someone saying, hack this target, and then the AI goes and does it, right? We're not seeing that yet. I still think we're a little ways off from that, but what we are seeing is, hey, for this PLC, what is the default password hidden within these 4 documents that are 500 pages long? Okay, that's the sort of activity we're starting to see, and that's going to enable the hacktivists or whoever a serious capability jump, because they're able to identify things much quicker. Now, would those adversaries be able to find these things normally? Yes. Without LLMs? Yes, they would. It would just take them longer. Okay, so it's about that speed and the capability increase in gap. It's about the capability increase, sorry. I hope that does answer your question there, Mike. Please jump in if it hasn't.
Nice, and it does come back to sort of the fundamentals, Gayatri, GRC, people, process, and technology within the organisation. I'm definitely hearing more on the importance of GRC, particularly in the Australian environment and around the legislative frameworks for compliance. You don't want compliance-driven security, but there is a risk there that compliance now has.
Absolutely, it does. And see, security is a moving goalpost, especially with all the conversions with IT, OT, IoT, everything coming together. It's becoming more difficult. And like Heath said, the AI is a productivity boost for us as well as the malicious actors. So while we're busy enhancing our capabilities using the AI to monitor our networks better and secure them better, there's always the other side of the classroom as well, trying to see how can they use to break it. And that means we have to be on our toes much more. And see, the way I kind of had this realization, I think yesterday, that GRC is very similar to the SIEM that we deploy in our infrastructure. GRC is the SIEM for decision makers and policymakers, right? That's the way we have to view it. It gives you an overall picture of what compliance are you looking at that you need to abide by? What frameworks have you got in the picture that you need to absolutely consider? And then what are your critical assets? Because the definition of assets itself has expanded so much. When we merge these two networks together, it becomes difficult. So, for example, let's say SOCI, every critical infrastructure entity in Australia needs to work according to the SOCI regulations. Great. But then as you go through and read the SOCI, it in turn mentions ISO 27001. It mentions Essential 8, and it also talks about the critical infrastructure network. And it also talks about your AES CSF. So for an organization, it can become a bit overwhelming. But then that's where your configuration for a GRC strategy comes in. You pick the bits out of each one because it's not the one size fitting all. And that's the investment our teams need to look at.
Tony, I imagine that there's an alignment there as you identify what those, not so much the gaps, but those compliance requirements. You need to focus on what's most important for each of the organisations. They're all different, as we saw from the audience profile. They all have different priorities, but then trying to find what those crossovers are, because again, not compliance-driven security, but if you can achieve compliance and improve your security posture, you focused your resources on the best output.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, if you think about a lot of these things like standards, the implementation of any standard requires you to customize it and tailor it directly to how your organization functions, the shape of it, where the systems are, where the processes are. So, I think aligning to something like ISO 27001 has its purpose and allows you to certainly gain a certification to show that you're doing well in security, but it doesn't at all mean that you're going to be secure when it comes down to looking at the industrial control systems on the OT side of the network. Similarly, we talk about the Essential 8 as being, mandatory, and we have to get to that stage for a lot of government organizations. Even if you get to Essential 8, maturity level 3 across your entire business, your industrial control systems are not going to be protected by that. So you need to consider what Essential 8 is actually doing for you and how that is going to play into your overall threat profile, and how you deploy security controls into those environments where, it is important. NIST have got their own standards around that. Cisco have released standards around that of how we do, we actually do security within control systems. But a lot of it comes down to the principles that we have within our GRC practices, things like building business continuity and building resilience into those environments, but then doing it in the nuanced way that you have to do it and understanding what that means in an OT and control environment. Confidentiality might not be the thing that we're concerned about in that OT environment. It's availability, or it could be integrity. It could be, the integrity of the control data that makes something run. If we change that could have an adverse effect against that system. So the focus might shift slightly about what what the controls even, I guess, are aligned to within the IT environment, in how we translate that into that OT environment.
Where does simulations play a role here? I think if you're looking at the end result, and I don't trust our poll framework that we're using in terms of who Polly is on our polls. I'm not going to run any more polls, but we were going to run one on the importance of cybersecurity to the organisation. So what's the motivation for the organisation, particularly if it's critical infrastructure? It might be the operating licence or that assurance of services. The other one is impact on reputation as well as safety of systems and people. Running exercises is a new national approach under the cybersecurity strategy as well. Is that a good way to start in terms of running an exercise within the organisation to not only heighten the awareness, but also identify what those gaps are and make sure you've got the resources to match the likely outcome or the impact of a cybersecurity incident? Just general observations on where organisations are in their exercise and simulation training. Maybe Gayatri, are you seeing that at a client level?
Yes, it is. It's very significant, Chris, because it is a simulation which is preparing you for the worst case scenario. You run the test drill and it's in a safe environment where you've got consultants walking you through and everybody's on board with the results. And the expectation is we will fail somewhere, but the target is that failure will lead us to close the gaps. Because if we don't fix them, that's the one entry any malicious actor requires to get in. And the sooner we do these simulations, the more frequently we do that, we make them as a muscle memory for our experts, for our SMEs. And because security is not one team, it's everyone, especially when you talk about the critical infrastructure, the physical teams on the site have much more significant role to play, as well as the remote teams, because the convergence allows an access both ways. So the more simulation you do, the more organized everyone is together, and there's less chances of the dropping a ball somewhere.
And Heath, the insights that you've got into these attacks and what the groups are actually doing, I think, again, would feed into that simulated exercise, right? So you say, basically, this is
Yes.
Healthcare sector, what's the previous attacks and what's the attack methodologies? Apply that to our own organisation, but they can be quite granular in terms of the detail that they apply within these exercises, right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So I was able to help assist a number of organizations as AEMO went through some really, really good scenarios based off of Vault Typhoon as it relates to those organizations. And all the ones I observed, the individual teams did relatively pretty well with it. However, it was the coming together, like what was just said, that actual comms piece throughout the whole piece was quite lacking across the board. And particularly, as we again spoke about, getting the information that is required down to the actual individual asset owners around what they need to do in a timely and an effective and a clear manner that's actual English, that isn't just cyber goop, right? That's a really key one. And particularly when we talk about those scenarios, they become really, really good baselines once we've done a number of key compliance pieces across the board. So once we've done a whole ton of compliance stuff across the board, a lot of people often have that what's next piece. And yes, we still need to be compliant and we still need to go down that route. But having accurate and detailed scenarios, in my view, is the best place to go next, as it's directly tailoring then your defenses to what the adversaries are actually doing that would have the capability and intent and the opportunity to target your organization.
It's a good point. You don't want to be running an exercise and being completely unprepared, because then you have a set result. You better obviously have some planning and strategy, and obviously some buy-in from executives and the board level, Tony. How do you sort of set this up? Before you run an exercise, you want to have some controls in place so that you are actually testing this appropriately, right?
Yeah, definitely. Look, the important thing about planning any type of tabletop exercise is to think about the audience, but also think about the maturity of the organization. You need to start by, have they done one of these before? If you've never done one before, then you want to consider end to end who needs to be involved. Don't try and boil the ocean. Don't try and do one that's got like a deep technical test sitting alongside one where you're expected to do an OAIC report because of a breach, a privacy breach, at the same time as trying to deal with journalists and newspapers looking for, feedback from the CEO. You're trying to coordinate too much, and it'll just fall on its face. I think the most practical advice is start with something that looks at business continuity and build out from there. So if your most critical systems fall over, what are you going to do about it? Have the directives coming at an executive level rather than having them have technical people making those decisions, because I think at that point you're talking about how the organization functions at a high level. Then you can drop down into the most important stuff in a further subsequent exercise where you actually look at the technical stuff. Does that make sense?
It does. It does come back to critical skill sets as well, though, within this particular area. Open it to all three of you, but yeah, just what are some of the critical skill sets here within the OT environment that's a little bit different from the IT environment in that cybersecurity context? Critical skills, Gayatri, GRC is still there, but not necessarily technical. So it doesn't have to be overly technical. You can get the process engineers involved as well when you do need to get technical.
We do that, and you'll see that this is absolutely industry agnostic. It's framework agnostic when the GRC comes to a certain extent when handling such situations. You really need someone who will not run around like a headless chicken, because the governance, the organizational layers and hierarchy that work during a critical infrastructure is very separate than what you would do in a BAU. So you need someone who can keep their calm, who can actually follow instructions through, follow the process through, and make some decisions. So what we've noticed is people who have exposure as a prior role in frontline responders, they do really great. They've handled previous situations. So they could be people who worked as paramedics. They could be people who worked in emergency services. They could be veterans, because having handled those stress in their other job lets them look at the situation in a little disconnected manner, because as a technical expert, you're more concerned about your asset and everything. You still need someone to stitch it all together, and that's critical.
Okay, I'm going to give it one more time. If I send this now, let's send now, and I'm not going to even close it now. Manual, save. No, it's not going to work. I'm going to work this out. Hang on. I'll share. Do you have, no, wrong one. Importance of priority for cybersecurity in the organisation. Let's see if that works. If not, this is the last chance. This is, here we go. Does that work?
Looks good. It looks good, man. It looks good. Yeah,
that
it looks
one's
good.
Working. Okay, go for it, ladies and gents. And the importance, priority of cybersecurity, operating license, operational assurance, impact of breach, or safety systems. Let's see if we can come out of that. I'm going to put it down as operating license for me because I won't be operating if I can't handle a simple poll.
And Chris, we've got a question on the poll about the role that frontline employees play in a GRC initiative.
Go for it.
The employees are our frontline safety. So the most important thing every employee is required to do is understand what your business does and what are the acceptable uses for your organization. We handle assets every day, each one of us does, and any single device, any endpoint can become the entry. All you need is one compromised asset and get in. So as long as our employees understand the rules of safety for your organization, the employees understand the confidentiality, integrity, and availability impact they could generate, they would be a very strong security layer for us.
Very good. And I think the outcome there is safety of systems and public. That's probably the best answer we wanted. I think it fits back to what we had in terms of our audience profile as well, public safety and public and people safety. Skill sets within the team, back into, say, the SOC and those kind of monitoring areas here, because maybe Tony, what you're seeing, or potentially Heath is also in terms of the Security Operations Centre versus the normal Operations Centre for critical infrastructure, how aligned those two come? What are you seeing within the sort of bringing the teams together and mixing and matching the monitoring, the sort of that visibility?
Do you want to go first, Heath?
I'll touch on it briefly, but then I'll throw it to yourself, mate. So
yeah,
I think from a lot of the stuff that I see, and it's really evident on the poll, the operations teams that I see, really safety and the actual asset integrity is the absolute core. Security is like the fifth thing they've got to worry about. Okay, we've got to actually defend against the people, right? And particularly when it comes to some of the control rooms that we have across Australia, where it's, hey, we need to make a decision on this within the next 5 seconds. Okay, those are where it's like, oh, you then can't also have in the loop there, what is the cybersecurity piece of this? Cybersecurity needs to be the enabler for those guys. That would be sort of my only piece. Tony?
Yeah, I think the way we've done traditional OT cybersecurity for such a long time needs to remain as it is, because the engineers that manage those systems are the people who understand the importance of those systems and understand how they work at the lowest level. They're also keeping up to date as things change. So as these systems become more internet enabled, those engineers are the people who actually really understand that stuff. The IT side of the house, we've got security operations, we've got our cyber people. What we need to do though is join them together. So it's that join that is still not functioning nearly anywhere as far as I can see. We have, solutions like what Dragos provide are fantastic, and they help us see and surface all of these threats as they appear within the environment. They help us gain an insight into what the assets are and things like that. And you can integrate those with your security operations centers so that you've got that visibility across the whole environment. But if you've got somebody who is trained on looking at IT threats, they're still not going to understand what they're seeing coming out of the Dragos tool, right? So what we need is a way to bridge that gap between the two environments and have one conjoined whole of business monitoring solution. And that is only going to come with training. It's going to come with the acceptance on the IT side that they don't know everything, and the acceptance on the OT side that they don't know everything. And there's a role that sits in the middle that bridges that gap. And it could be 1, it could be 2, it could be 10 people, depending on the size of the organization. But there is a place for that sits in the middle that orchestrates that connectivity tissue between the two sides of the organization.
This question might relate. What criteria should a company use to qualify their asset critical risk rating under SOCI? How do they start to qualify those risks? And I take it's easy when you do have visibility because you can see it and start to measure it. But is there a particular approach that you might have?
Gayatri, did you have any answers on that one?
Yes, so the SOCI Act lists out some key asset categories that each of the business industries should be looking at. So if you're in the communications, all your broadcasting devices are critical assets. If you are in healthcare, you'd have different subsets. So all the equipment in the hospital would become critical. But you also have to remember that the definition of the assets to be covered in the SOCI has just changed. So there's an amendment to the SOCI Act that's in progress right now. And what it says is it's not just the actual assets of the OT assets that are critical, it's also the underlying assets that support your OT infrastructure, which are critical now. So the definitions will broaden. And it's important to go back to the reference guide from SOCI for your respective business and understand in each industry, what is the bare minimum mandate? Because that mandate will then require you to have that critical incident management risk plan also in place that your organization will have to report against. So start with the guidelines, do your risk plan accordingly.
Yeah, that's a really good answer, Gayatri. I was just going to say that, you know, that comes back to how we identify those systems of national significance, as they're known. It's a risk-based process that we have to go through. You know, what is the impact of compromise of one of those? You're going to identify then what the cost of a breach or the cost of downtime or the cost of loss of integrity of the information that goes through that system or the system itself. And that gives you an idea of how much you need to protect it. You know, if that small valve in your water treatment plant or that transformer in your electric supply system is going to be the most important thing in your entire grid, for example, then, you know, you're prioritizing that at the top of the list. You're putting more monitoring around it. You're putting more controls around it, and you're making sure that it is patched and it's up to date and all of those sort of things. So it kind of that risk-based approach drives everything that you do within your security program to protect all your assets. Some of them will be critical. Some of them are supporting, but they're all important to one extent or another.
Gayatri, maybe into the enterprise risk management criteria as well. Is there a differentiation between what was required under SOCI and the critical infrastructure risk management sort of process that they just went through, the CRIMP or the CIRNP, versus enterprise risk management? Is there a gap, or can you align the enterprise risk management plan through all the way down into what the requirements are under SOCI?
So yes, we can. And that's the way to go, because you have to have a consolidated view. Usually, or rather historically, what has happened is the enterprise risk looks at all the corporate assets, but the OT environment has been expected to be a silo. So they're always managed separately. They have limited visibility in the central part of the organization. But in order to succeed, we'd have to match it. And the basic definition of the enterprise risk is we identify critical assets for the business. And that critical asset extends from our enterprise network into the OT network as well. What the SOCI Act does for you is it tells you you cannot avoid these. So these automatically come to the top of your list. They are in the OT environment and you have to look at it. And traditionally, when you're in the enterprise, you will always consider your servers, you consider your endpoints. But because not everybody has an insight into how the OT devices operate, there's a chance that you have a miss somewhere. This tries to cover the gap in between. And then obviously, it's important to have all the right players in the table. So when you're doing your enterprise security, you have to have people who represent your OT networks in there. They are the real experts. They'll tell you where you can actually control it. They know the kill chain better in the OT environment than anyone else would. So have them together.
Well, hopefully that answered your question for Adam there. Now, last poll in terms of common pain points, and will we have this area that should work if all going well? That maybe, yes, your common pain points here. And you've got a drop down there. So people orientated, process orientated, or technology orientated is an interesting one. And then we will finish off with focusing on what is the most common one there. Tech orientated for me today on running polls on Teams. People orientated. So this might be a good one. It's swapping over between tech. Let's focus on, there's some interest there in skills, workforce, even stress here. I won't say running a Teams webinar is too stressful, but What are you currently seeing? Is there any shortfalls, Gayatri, in GRC? How are you finding the skill sets and demands for GRC at the moment? Because I imagine I've heard some CISOs talking about it was a 2 to 3 year process in relation to responding to SOCI for a large enterprise. The skill sets, any challenges within workforce?
It is. It is because, again, it goes back to the same challenge. We've operated the environments on enterprise and OT in silos. And the GRC, in definition, has to allow you a single view. As Tony mentioned a little ago, it's important to have cybersecurity and cyber-aware people in your OT teams and OT network-aware people in your GRC teams as well. And that does take time. It's an upskilling activity which has to be very conscious. And then, throw in the mix of all the legal requirements, all the regulatory revisions. So you also need somebody who is well-versed in legalese to help you interpret all of that. So the skill set actually gets a bit difficult. And if you're expecting one single person to be able to do all this for you, it'd be a unicorn that we're looking for. So instead, you have a team with experts from across the table, across the skill sets that you need. And that's much more effective and much more relevant now, while we actually wait for a person who can actually pick it all up together. And then you have to remember that person would be a very niche skilled entity, a lot in demand, and retaining those employees then with that skill set and that experience becomes another challenge. So have a backup plan, get the experts together.
And there was a bit of response there to the technology, changing environment and the like. Heath, Tony, well, maybe to Heath in terms of skill sets within the monitoring aspect and the critical infrastructure, sort of threat intel aspect. I take it from an analyst viewpoint. Is there a shortage, or do you find there's an impact on stress levels for them, given the amount of intel coming through?
So I think the bit where we really have a proper skills gap is the Australian intelligence community is quite small. And the knowledge that comes out of there often sadly leaves Australia because there isn't enough either roles or they can get paid way more in the US and the UK. So we often have quite a large gap from that perspective, from an actual intelligence background with the knowledge there. That's definitely one that does hamper quite a lot of things, because from an intel perspective, there's a little bit more to it from a monitoring perspective. But in terms of the general threats to ICS space, we sort of really try to sort of piece. We really just like to grab just asset owners and operators, just clean out of an environment and teach them cyber. We find that that's a lot easier to do than to sort of give someone take someone from cyber and teach them about OT. We definitely prefer the latter method. There's a number of sort of reasons why and all that sort of stuff. But so for example, one of our recent hires was a SCADA engineer within the Australian nuclear sector, and hadn't really touched much in terms of the actual IT and cyber bit, but she's already killing it from that piece, because she understands the actual flow of data and processes and what should and shouldn't be going on within those environments immediately. And yes, she needs to know about all the different protocols and all that sort of stuff, but that bit's easy. That bit's easy compared to the OT side.
Well, that leads us to what Tony sort of said at the outset in terms of references to AUKUS. We've got potentially whole new industries coming through in support of a sort of a nuclear-related sector, particularly in South Australia and Western Australia. Tony, skill sets from what you've seen, and sorry to say, you and I have been around for quite a while. The changes within the skill sets don't fundamentally change, but it's getting the insights into the OT environments from a cybersecurity context is it's a skill set in demand, I suppose, increasingly so.
Yeah, it is. And, I over the last few years, I've seen a lot of cybersecurity people that have taken up the mantle to become OT experts as well. And, they're taking courses through SANS, and they're doing the training, and they're starting to use the tools. So it is happening, but I think it's too slow for what we need. And we definitely need more people that are training up on this. And I think it's almost incumbent on organizations, service providers, all of us to invest in that training, because if we don't, then we're basically behind the 8 ball. We need to be ahead of this. We need to be building strategies, not just tinkering in the weeds. And the only way we're going to do that is have the people who train today become the strategists and the leaders of tomorrow in this kind of conjoined, converged environment that we're talking about. And this is where, bridging that gap between people, systems, processes, et cetera, is going to become really important. We will see an extension of policy happen over time as this becomes more prescient, and undoubtedly as these systems also become more controllable remotely, and we need to start patching them more, and some of them are going to be living in the cloud, then you're going to see a convergence across all aspects of the organization. So by the time we get nuclear submarines, I think everything will be different, and it's incumbent on us to make sure we understand what's coming and keep up with it, because by then we're talking about potentially quantum computing, we're talking about AI, we're talking about different types of networks and control systems that are completely different, and security that's different as well. We'll have new platforms out there, so we need to be keeping up and just making sure that our people are being trained accordingly.
And I would just
go ahead.
Sorry, Chris. And I would just also say the barrier to entry about learning OT is slowly coming down. So we ran a really, really good 60-day threat hunting workshop for a range of different stakeholders in Sydney. But prior to this sort of thing, shout out to SANS, they do great work, but the minimum baseline to do OT training shouldn't be $15,000. We need to have that knowledge be more dispersed and be more readily accessible. There is stuff out there and it's slowly getting out into where it needs to, but we need to sort of be a little bit faster with it, I would say.
The other point I was going to raise there is partners and having a partner network as well as service providers, but that partners, and it does kind of highlight Dragos and Kinetic in terms of how those two are working. Maybe, Tony, the insights into here, and we didn't address it even at the start in terms of the relationship, but Dragos is obviously well known internationally in terms of its critical infrastructure work. And how does Kinetic and IT and Dragos work together and servicing clients?
Yeah, this is a really important thing for Kinetic IT of how we've developed our capabilities. So we've had a SOC for a long time. We're dealing with a lot of government and critical infrastructure. So we're looking at threats, we're evaluating things, we're doing the response elements regularly. But as we've started to move deeper into this critical infrastructure space, we're seeing a lot of attacks that are starting to target the deeper parts of those environments, because they can bridge that gap. They're going across firewalls into OT environments. And as a result, we needed a solid partner that was going to give us the insight and the visibility across those OT networks that we just can't get any other way. We did some evaluations across a whole bunch of different product sets, and Dragos was the one that we've decided to partner with because of the expertise. The CEO was very well known in this space, but we've also got a very good relationship with the team, and they're very flexible and work really closely with us to make sure that our team and their team works together. So really that thing that we're talking about converging the IT and OT space, we've done it within our SOC capability so that we can layer that onto our customer environment. So to help them get to that point, we need the customers to obviously be responding on their side with people who can also bridge that gap, so that it's a kind of seamless environment for us to talk about incident response, leading from IT environments through to OT environments, making sure the right people go from keyboards into screwdrivers whenever we're talking about response, right? I mean, it is that kind of a relationship with Dragos that drives what we're trying to achieve here.
And Gayatri, in terms of how you would apply this back into the GRC roles, having that insights from partners like Dragos gives you a bit of the detail, as you say, from, what was it, the keyboard to the screwdriver, Tony? I like that.
Yeah,
absolutely it does, Chris, because we have to be very conscious of the fact that not every organization has the capability or the budget or the bandwidth to have all the required skills. You have to have the right partnership. You have to be able to reach out to experts in the industry in a similar job or in the cyber industry to be able to leverage that information together, to be able to leverage the skill sets. And see, when you consider the critical assets in infrastructure, you're also worried about not breaching the other requirements on privacy and everything. But then that's where the legislation understanding with your partners comes through. Each of these regulations allow you to share information where it is preventing further harm. So when you have people like Dragos on your team with you, they can tell you similar patterns that are relevant to your industry. They don't have to divulge the details, but they will tell you there's a similar alert coming up from an industry that is relevant to you. And you reach out and you get the assistance you require, either through consultants to customize a solution to you, or you upskill your own game then.
Nice. Now, look, just as we close off, this is the last opportunity to ask some questions. There's some resources here, and I put today's report in the chat as well in terms of that ASD report. There's some very good case studies in that particular report as well. I don't know if you've had a chance to look, but Heath, maybe finishing off, you had some case studies to start, but that threat landscape, have you had a chance to look through that report and any of the case studies? There's some good ones on healthcare and the like. And just in terms of some of the numbers, would it be consistent to what you're seeing? 11% of 11% of cyber attacks in Australia hitting critical infrastructure. Is that about what you would expect, or is that not too bad?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So we can only really observe, because we very strictly deal with critical infrastructure, so we can't really be a gauge for how much should be aligned to it. So, but I would expect that number to be more, to just be frank. I think that number does get sort of weighed down by smaller mum and dad shops sort of being responded to. And I think the piece there that's sort of the really one that I really like to understand, and I haven't been able to find it yet in the report, is of those 11% or of the organizations that were compromised, what was the impact to the larger Australian economy and people, right?
Yeah. I
think we all remember at the start of this year, there was quite a large piece that happened to support infrastructure. And that was basically World War III had ended and we were at the end of it. And there was immediate panic for about a week, right? The 11%, while yes, it's a small number, the impact that 11% can have on everyone else is absolutely massive. The piece that I'll sort of just mention as well, just on a previous question, I was on a call with an incident response piece with an organization in Australia a couple of weeks ago, and I think there was 7 or 8 different vendors, parties, and people on this call, all looking to move towards the sort of one piece. And in terms of why we do it and why we try to partner with guys like Kinetic is because we can't be the only people saying the things that we want to see people move towards, right? We really have to do this as a collective. It can't just be the one person in the corner saying we need to do this. If we all do it together and we all move together, we'll get much, much better change and much better, reception to the things we're trying to get people to do. Cybersecurity in OT is not impossible. It can be done. We had a really, really good case study this year of a small to medium electric utility defeating and keeping out a A-team player on a Chinese-based adversary from their network for 11 months, okay? By just doing good governance and good fundamentals, being able to understand the threat and pivot on it, and then be able to communicate. That's it. They didn't have the biggest budgets. They didn't have all this. A small to medium electric utility. It can be done. Cybersecurity is a team sport, and that's where we all sort of fail on it. It can be done. It can be done.
And I think it also comes back to understanding the business that you're in as well. So what those critical aspects are. Look, we've only got 5 minutes to go. Maybe some closing comments, and just from, I'll keep this up. I just want to at least thank the panel. Thank you very much, Gayatri Prasad, there in Perth with Tony Campbell. Gayatri, maybe a closing comment, even on the back of the ASD report today. What's your sort of key message for the audience, understanding the profile that we had, how can they sort of reach out to you?
So Chris, once again, thank you for having us here, and it was good to be able to share the stage, share the expertise. And what I would suggest is that one size does not fit all. While we're talking the critical infrastructure and we all work towards complying to the SOCI, it has to get customized. We have to be able to understand how the business operates, how your teams are structured, where your position, where your assets are. And it would be good to have a discussion further on. Reach us. We've got the Dragos partnership, which helps us to bring the technical aspects as well. And unless we understand everything, carrying a solution for someone else doesn't always give you the right answer. And that's where a lot of teams feel that security becomes counterproductive for them. That's not the idea. We're not getting a certification. You can take a certification to the market, but it doesn't give you the peace of mind. And you've seen a lot of jokes where the size of the people who lose their sleep the first. It is because they're still not confident that the assets are secure. A good team helps you make that happen.
And Tony, finishing off, I think with that example Heath provided where cybersecurity in OT can be done and it can be done well, but it doesn't come without planning and the appropriate strategy, right? You need to do that first before you can really face a skilled adversary.
Yeah, undoubtedly, Chris. Look, the key takeaway from all of this for me is that, cybersecurity isn't something that you do in a silo. It has to be integrated with the whole business. The reason why we do security is to protect the business functions so they actually can continue working. We need to train people. People need to be working together. So those two sides of the organization really need to be collaborating. Compliance has its place. We do compliance so that we can drive better security into the environments. So think about both. Don't just think about ticking the boxes. Think about actually implementing good security controls, and then getting that visibility across the whole environment, not just looking at OT in isolation, but how do you compare that to what's going on in IT and then bridge that gap with skills and visibility and systems across it that allow you to keep an eye on everything.
Nice. Well, look, that's it for us at the top of the hour. Please reach out to Kinetic, a trusted public sector partner, offices nationally as well. As I mentioned or alluded to, Tony and I have known each other for a long time and been aware of worked with the Kinetic team for many years over time, and same with Dragos. In fact, we've had Robert Lee on, even with Malcolm Turnbull, one of the key investors in Dragos, there on the important work that you guys do as well. And Gayatri Prasad, also thank you very much for your insights today. That's it from us. Thank you very much for joining us. This recording will be available to you, particularly for those that have registered and were able to make the live session. Thank you for participating in the polls. They all went flawlessly, no doubt, except for the first one. But thank you very much for attending and enjoy the rest of your day. We'll close off this session. Thank you very much, speakers.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Chris.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.